one of the things I noticed is that we have a huge number of agents in Auckland relative to the number of listings. If I compare it to, say, Sydney, if you look at the number of transactions that a Sydney agent does compared to Auckland, it's almost 2 to 1.
Wow.
So we have a lot of agents relative to the number of homes. They are all having to compete for this little slice of the pie. And I thought, this is where it's not working. When you go to join an agency, if you're new, they often get you to work the buyers. So they take the most junior people and say, you can go off and run buyers. If you're coming in and you're working buyers, you're going to get a little teeny tiny cut of someone else's fee that you then have to split with your own business as well. And the problem with this industry, there's low trust across all groups, right? No one trusts anyone.
And actually, that buyer's agent is actually a seller's agent just working with the
Precisely.
buyer.
This is often your largest asset. Like, get a good agent and they're worth their weight in gold. Business owners, as both of you would know, are people who understand the value of getting a really good consultant to do something better than you can do it yourself. I'm going to say something controversial. For years, I've heard how technology is going to take over and there'll be no need for real estate agents. So long as there is emotion, there will always be a need for real estate agents. What's the most meaningful lesson I have learned in the last 12 months? That's a great question. Well done, Jen. Tricky one too. I like the car question.
We're not going to let you off the hook there. Welcome to Home Run. This week, we've got Alex Martelli. Now, Alex is inspirational. She's brave. And she runs one of New Zealand's leading buyer agencies. Now, that's something we're going to talk more about, but her background's huge experience in international property, headed up a couple of large real estate agencies, buyer divisions in the UK, was it Singapore?
Hong Kong.
I mean, these are the lovely places, but here you are in New Zealand, and you've been up and running for a few years now.
Yeah, a couple of years.
Yeah. So buyer's agencies, let's get straight into it.
Okay.
I think people have often worked with a buyer's agent, but maybe they weren't even a buyer's agent. What exactly is a buyer's agent? Can you tell us more?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's an interesting term. That idea that a real estate agent markets himself as a buyer's agent, I found to be unique to New Zealand. When I lived over in Sydney, you don't get that. Sales agents focus on selling because that's what they're really good at doing. And then you'd have a committed, dedicated buyer's agent. So in the context of what we're discussing in terms of an actual technical buyer's agent is someone who has a fiduciary responsibility to the buyer. They solely represent the interests of a buyer in a transaction. And it covers a few different things. And I'm going to talk about it in the New Zealand context. It's quite different to a buyer's agency in Australia and the UK. And I've formed it this way because I saw what we did in Australia, I saw the market in the UK, and I saw the market in Hong Kong. And I thought, how do we take the best of each thing and then cater it to New Zealand buyers? So what you're essentially saying is that you have someone in your corner, someone who's representing your best interests, because the difficulty here is that the real estate agent has a fiduciary responsibility to vendor and a duty of care to a buyer. And I feel sorry for agents because it must be very hard trying to marry those two things. It's, you're talking about two groups of people often coming from very, very different perspectives and different objectives as well. So we complete all of our due diligence for the buyer. We know the market very well. We tell our buyer, here's how much you should actually pay for the property. Here's our strategy to buy the property. Do we bring the option forward? Do we leave it? Do we think it's going to pass in? If it's a negotiation, how much should we pay for it? What can we do to incentivize? What have we heard through the market about that property? We went to auction on a property last week where I knew a couple of agents who had appraised the property. I knew what they had appraised it at, so I already knew what the vendor's sort of expectation is. So you end up gathering a lot of insight. But what we've essentially said is we are going to make ourselves experts in a market looking through the buyer's perspective and just solely helping a handful of clients at any one time. So it's a niche service. It's a small number of people because the bulk of our work is in that due diligence process. And if I were to say how it differs to what I did in Australia and the UK, in Australia, you're often, because the market's often on quite a high rise, you're just trying to say, here's how we're going to buy the property and secure it. And often it's a pre-auction offer. You do a fair amount of due diligence, but the homes I find in Sydney are just generally better built. And a lot of what you're buying over there is apartments as well, much more common. In the UK, it's a very different market because you don't have auctions. So then you're dealing with negotiation and what your savings are. In fact, in the buyer's agents in the UK, they often charge a percentage of the savings off the asking price. And then completely different out in Hong Kong, especially if you're buying back into the UK, but you're dealing with Hong Kong buyers in terms of what their incentives is, and that tends to be very education driven. But here in New Zealand, when we came back to Auckland, the bulk of our work actually sat in the due diligence piece. It's what's lying underneath? What do we need to know about this property? What's happening with the development site down the road? Who lives next door? What are they going to do? Do we give them a call? Find out, if there's a developer next door. Do they intend to build $5 million homes or $1 million homes? So a lot of it is doing that really in-depth research and saying, that's a good home. That one I'm probably going to suggest you pass on. And then we see everything. We oversee the entire process. But ultimately, everything we do is in the best interest of the buyer. And the real estate agent has, then they can represent their vendor and really focus on that side of the transaction.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the obligations on salespeople. And so traditional seller representing agencies have the fiduciary obligation to the seller and a duty of care to the buyer. So does that mean that you have a fiduciary obligation to the buyer, but a duty of care to the seller?
So if we were dealing with a seller direct, then yes, we would, because you'd be putting it around the other way. Vast majority of properties that we buy, there is a sales agent involved, even for the ones that are off-market. And I'm happy to have a chat about off-market properties, but we buy quite a few off-market. They'll typically usually still have a sales agent involved. Couple of times we've bought directly through vendors and it's not ideal. And we try to ask vendors, please engage a real estate agent because agents know what they're talking about. They know the market and also they're there to represent your interests. I find it interesting people who get caught up in the weeds of things go, the 1% fee and the 2%. And I just think, but this is often your largest asset. Like get a good agent and they're worth their weight in gold. And at least they can represent your interests and I can represent the buyer's interests as well. So typically we really just focusing on the buyer because the agent can look after the vendor.
Quite interesting to hear you say that because I know that perhaps some people that have considered being buyer agents, it's almost like the reason they're doing that is they've got a little bit of a chip on their shoulder against the traditional real estate agency model. It sounds like you kind of have respect for that and you're really just wanting to bring, a similar expertise to bear, but in favour of the buyer.
Yeah, I do. And I think the problem is, because I've heard this for years, I've heard how technology is going to take over and there'll be no need for real estate agents. So long as there is emotion, there will always be a need for real estate agents because people have an emotional connection to their property and what they perceive it to be worth, and buyers have an emotion, connected to the property or to their own property as well. So the agents are there to give you good advice, but also to market the property in that very period of time. Because the value of a home can vary month to month according to how much competition you have. What's happening with the property, what's happening with the climate, anything, what's happening in the economy. So the agent is there to try and secure you the best outcome. It's not always about price either. It's trying to find the right buyer for the property who has the settlement that's going to work for you or can meet your requirements, your negotiating requirements. Most people want top price, but not all. And we've had this before where we've dealt with, especially in off-market transactions, where actually people's confidentiality and privacy trumps taking the property to the market, trying to get top dollar for it. So different motivations for different people. We shouldn't all assume everyone hates agents and wants top price. They don't. But it's interesting your point. A number of people who have come to me and said, I want to be a buyer's agent. They go, because I've had a bad experience as a buyer relating to the sales agent. I go, well, just be mindful here. The agent's in a really difficult situation. They're trying to do the best thing by the vendor. Sometimes buyers do feel a little hard done by the agents, and sometimes rightly so. And other times I think, well, the agent has their responsibilities.
It's interesting, the difference between markets. And I know we're going to focus mostly on the New Zealand market, but I'm keen to hear what you learned from other markets. And also I remember a good mate of mine in the States, he wanted to buy a holiday home, I think in Lake Tahoe or something. He lives in the Bay Area. he says to me, hey mate, any tips on choosing an agent? And so I started going in and giving you a few tips. And it was only after a couple of minutes that the kind of penny dropped for both of us that he was talking about selecting a buyer's agent.
Oh,
and
you
I
were
was
talking about
totally. And it just goes to show the mentality. I mean,
Yeah.
so perhaps that's part of it, but I guess there's a different framework there. But I guess it's much more common in other markets to engage a buyer's agent. And perhaps that's going to come here. But in some respects, almost the way our legislation is crafted, that does provide some consumer protection, even when dealing with a seller agent. It has perhaps allowed it to continue without having created that.
I find it
disagree
much more,
with me, please, if you do.
I think it's interesting because there are much more blurred lines here of agents who act as a buyer's agent. The challenge I have here is that there are some sales agents who are really good at working with buyers. I brought in a lady called Karen Atwood. She deals with all of our North Shore clients, and she's fantastic. And the reason she's fantastic, and I got to know her, is that I was a buyer, and she followed up with me and followed up with me and followed up with me. And she was very honest about the house. And I thought, you're actually a better buyer's agent. You really care for the well-being of the buyer. And she's got the side of her that loves investigating property. So that's great for our business because a lot of what we do is investigative. But I think the problem with a buyer's agent here is that when you go to join an agency, if you're new, they often get you to work the buyers. So they take the most junior people and say, you can go off and run buyers. I personally wouldn't want my money being dictated by the junior newcomer to the business. I just wouldn't.
Actually, yeah.
The other thing is that they don't have that responsibility. They're ultimately, if you're coming in and you're working buyers, you're going to get a little teeny tiny cut of someone else's fee that you then have to split with your own business as well. So for David buying a property and whether you pay 1.2 or 1.4, I don't care because the fee split is going to be so tiny.
And actually, this is worthwhile digging into. That buyer's agent is actually a seller's agent just working with the buyer.
Precisely. And I'll tell you an example. I had a lady approach me and she goes, I want to be a buyer's agent. I said, okay. And I said, why is that? She goes, well, I already work with buyers. I feel that they should pay me. And I said, well, you already receive, a split when you work with buyers.
I think there's an REA rule about not getting paid from both sides of the transaction here for good reason.
Exactly. And that is a real problem. People understanding why that is so essential. Anyway, she said, and I'm really good at working with buyers and convincing them what's a good property. I said, again, not really what we want. We don't need to be convincing our buyers of anything. That's not our role. Anyway, she told me this property and I said, that sold for a record price. She said, yes, that was me. I got them to pay that. I was like, I don't think you've understood. But for her, she said, well, I've secured a property and I did what I need to do to secure the property. And she took a percentage of that fee. And I thought, this is where it's not working. The other thing is, and the difficulty is what we do, we go out and we find everything. So we work really hard to find all the off markets, the pre-market, the on market. We try to give you as many options as possible. That is our business. That's our full-time job, 7 days a week. For a very small number of clients, we keep a handful of clients at one time because it is a lot of work. Someone who's working as a buyer's agent, they're going to go through their database and say you work for Barfoot's, so you've got access to the Barfoot's properties. You know what fee split you're going to get as a buyer's agent, but sales agent. Then you might go to Ray White. And then back in the days of unlimited potential, they often would have a restriction on conjunctional arrangements. So that buyer's agent might sway their view on which property they're going to introduce you to according to what split might come through. And I'm not going to put that across all agents. They might come right to me. That's not how we operate. But the truth is that the fee splits that they are taking is relatively small to work with. So I think from a genuine buyer's perspective, you just need to be aware of that. And I feel sorry for some sales agents because people then go, I asked the agent to help me and they didn't. I said, well, did you show any loyalty to them? A number of agents who have told me I worked with a buyer and worked hard and worked hard and worked hard. And then one weekend they rang me up and said, oh, you'll be terribly excited for me. I bought another property through a different agent. And I'm not a charity. So I can see why, particularly your really top agents, they won't work buyers. In fact, the top agents now refer buyers over to us because they say, I'm good at selling property. That's what we excel in and that's what we're going to focus on. You're a buyer's agent. You pick up the buyers. So we really stay in our lane as well. You know, we would never dabble in sales. We don't do management. We don't deal with anything. We just buy property. Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I think what will happen is increasingly they will start to see particularly the benefit of it. And we talked a little bit about that before we started this podcast, about having to push through barriers and trying something new. And when I first set up the business, I went to these agencies, and the number of agents who push back, that won't work. It's not the Kiwi DIY way. And you hear these things. And the very first supporter of me, big supporter, was Glenn Carpenter. Now, he runs a tight team, and they're really good at selling properties. And he said, I love what you're doing. I think it's going to take off. I want you to come in and meet my team. And he got me in front of that whole team, and all three branches. And I got up and I said, I would like you to work with me because I'm bringing you qualified buyers. I understand the market, so I'm not going to waste your time. And it's almost like a business-to-business transaction. You go, okay, what does your vendor want? What's important to them? Here's what's important to my buyer. Can we do a deal here? So it almost becomes more commercial in nature and trying to take some of the emotion out. So he was brilliant. Thomas Farmer, Ray White Remiro was one of the next teams to get me in and say, we can really see the benefit. And suddenly particular top agents were going, that's what I want to do. I'm going to focus on sales, and you focus on buying.
Which is fantastic.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
So you mentioned that initially when you started, you got a lot of backlash in terms of, because that wasn't the norm, eh? So is there a particular price bracket with these houses that works really well versus any price bracket that doesn't?
It's an interesting question, because again, when I first started it, they go, oh, that's a luxury service. That's for the multi-millionaires. I said, well, it's not. I've seen how I ran my business and what I was doing in Australia and up in the UK.
Probably more a first home buyer.
It is. Well, it's interesting. There's different categories of people who really need the help of a buyer's agent. First-time buyers, a lot of stock. How do you qualify what's good and what's rubbish? So a lot of due diligence on those properties. So 50% of the transactions we did in 2024 were first-time buyers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that's lovely to be able to help people get on the ladder and make sure they're buying a good home. Yeah. Because the thing they struggle with is they've saved really hard to buy that property. They can't afford to find out that there's an issue with it. Yeah. You know, it's really high risk for them. So you're really holding their hand and guiding them through it and saying, that's why we're going to buy that little brick and tile, because it's sturdy as it comes. And they go, oh, but she's a bit ugly and I could buy a 4-bedroom home further out. You go, nope, we're going to buy the brick and tile because it's tidy, it's good. We've looked at the zoning, we've looked at the neighbours, you know, these are good properties. So you get your first time buyers. Probably the category we get a huge number of is working professionals, and it's the second property they've bought. Right. So they might have 1 or 2 children and they've grown out of their current home, but both mum and dad are working really hard, and they're usually very good at what they do. We work with a lot of business owners, and I think business owners, as both of you would know, are people who understand the value of getting a really good consultant to do something better than you can do it yourself. A lot of people who work in medicine who know the actual value of their time. Same with lawyers. They can say, I know how much I can charge my hours out at. Doing this property search and going out and meeting building inspectors is not the best use of my time. As you go further up, so let's say over 5 million, the off-market market is huge. So we were dealing with a client recently. The vast majority of the properties we went and looked at were off-market, and then qualified those down and ended up showing them 6 off-markets, 1 on-market, and then we bought an off-market property. So, and it's because obviously as you go further up, the online listings become more limited. Yeah. And they rang me. They said, look, we have the cash to spend, we've got a good budget, but there's only 2.
We just want to know the options.
Yeah. There were only 2 online listings that sat within their price range. Wow. So we went out and looked at 11, reduced it down to 6 plus 1 on market, and then bought this off-market property. Interestingly, that vendor went on and bought an off-market property, and my clients have sold their property off-market. So there's a whole market there that's shifting quietly just because people
value their privacy.
They want privacy, and they're also quite commercially minded people. They're not going to go out and they don't always want to go down the auction campaign. They say, here's the value I want for my home. And you look at it, you go, actually, that's about right. And let's see what we can do to come to a deal.
You touched on a few of the things quite quickly that you consider in your due diligence and in deciding whether a property is, inverted commas, good.
Yeah.
Could you run us through with a bit of detail your process of due diligence, what you
should look at or what you look at, and how you weight those things in the decision making?
Sure. There's the technicalities of the property. What's it actually built from? Is it in a vintage that we consider good? We also try to come with a solutions-based attitude, which is just because a home's plaster doesn't mean you should run for the hills, because it will have been bought and sold before, but what do we need to know about the plaster? So, and obviously you get a building inspector in to help with that as well. That's the technical part.
So tell us, though, you mentioned, is it from a good vintage?
Yeah.
What are some good vintages and what are some that we should be wary of?
So if you were to buy, a lot of people come to me and they go, we've got 1.8 and we want to buy a villa in Grey Lynn. I go, okay. Personally, if I was going to buy a wooden villa, I think you need to be more up at 2.5 million, because the quality is just going to be a bit better, especially in some of those top postcodes. I really like properties that were built in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and even going into the 70s. There's some really cool houses. Sunken lounges are back in fashion. So we had one the other day that had an indoor spa covered up. That was interesting. Whereas then obviously you get into the monolithic clad issues. And you and I talked about this before. Some cladding is fine if it had treated timber, and you need to know when certain types of timber were treated and when they weren't.
Yeah.
If a property, just because also a property is on a cavity doesn't mean it's good. I had one that I was looking at on a cavity and the agent was like, oh, it's on cavity, it's all fine, just buy. And you go, but the product they had used under the cavity wasn't particularly good. And so sometimes we end up ordering the property files and looking into it as well. Mm. And that could be a bit of my field, because when you order the property files, it could be 165 files in there. And it's like,
I think it could be 1,000 pages in there.
Yeah. So we don't promise our clients we're going to read every document in the property file, but it is interesting when you actually research it, and this is why it's really important for agents to know that this isn't a way to hold back a property. It might actually help you. If you understand the background on something, it might explain why something is showing as non-compliant on the limb. But these homes do involve a little bit more research and investigation. Mm. So you take the technicalities of the property, and then you look at, okay, well, what's the ownership of a property next door? So I'll give you an example. I was looking at a property recently. There's a big empty site next door. For a lot of buyers, that would spook them, like, development site. And you go, well, let's look into it. So I found who owned the development site, rang the guy, because there's no building consent against it. Well, he's planning to build a couple of luxury homes, which are going to sell for about $4 or $5 million. That's going to benefit your property. So yes, you might have to deal with construction for a couple of years, but he's got a great reputation. And actually, you might end up benefiting off the...
It's not a KO or a development.
It's not a KO development. The interesting thing, even with the KO developments, is understanding what sort of development's going up. I had a client who asked me to...
As in, what sort of product they're building there?
Yeah, because they're building all sorts of different social housing as well. Mm. So most people don't want to be directly next to a KO development, and it's had a lot of heat and a lot of bad reputation. But knowledge is power. Understanding not just what's happening in my property, but what's happening in the properties around me gives you an element of protection or awareness as to what you need to think about in the future. I bought a property recently for a client, beautiful property, and it had a volcanic volcanic shaft overlay, which meant, and that trumps other types of zoning. So technically, the guy next door could develop up, and on the title it showed as one chap owning 800 square meters, at which point my buyers might lose their view. They had a bit of a city view. But then you go over and actually speak to the neighbours, and it turns out it had been recorded incorrectly. It's actually two different neighbours. They're not going anywhere in a hurry. And so you couldn't actually justify developing those two sites. So there's no guarantee for my buyers, but it gives them peace of mind that they have done as much due diligence as possible to understand. The other thing, so those are all your technicalities. Possibly just as important is, what's the vendor's expectation, and where is the agent guiding other buyers and guiding the vendor as well? So there's a few different factors happening at that time. If you find out that you've got an unrealistic vendor, well, what's the point of even starting to go down that path? And has the vendor been unrealistic 6 months ago, but now becoming more realistic, but has missed the market? Well, you might end up buying that for a really good price now. So, and this is one of the difficulties we talk about, that point of choosing your real estate agent. Too many people pick the agent who sets the highest price, and then they hang onto that price and they end up losing their audience. So sometimes buying a property that's been on the market for 3 months isn't the worst thing in the world, because they're now at a point where they're having to move on, but but you're not competing with the masses.
We've got to go a bit deeper on these things because we're glossing through, but they're so important. So there's a couple of parts to this. One is the aspect of how you sort of work out what the vendor's wanting and how the agent is guiding the vendor and how they're guiding buyers. And then we also need to talk about the appraisal piece and selection of agents. So let's do them in that order. Let's go into that. You're researching, you're finding suitable property, and now we've done the technicality piece, but you don't want to go too deep into that due diligence because there might not be a deal to make if the vendor's sitting above the market.
Exactly.
How do you work that out?
You're trying to balance so many things at once. You think,
when everything's going to auction, or it's PBN, or like how do you?
Every property has a different strategy to it. If I look back at every single deal we did, there's a story.
But there'll be some patterns.
There is. You can generally tell, again, that's market knowledge and understanding. Has the vendor got realistic price expectation? How many times have they taken it to market previously? That gives you a pretty big idea as to how motivated they are. If they've already been on the market 3 times, you said, well, property's not the problem. It's your vendor that's got an issue with what it's actually worth. Understanding, classic one is you go in and it's fully renovated, and I'll look at it and you can tell the quality of a renovation. So I'll say to the agent, well, can you give me a breakdown in the works that have been done? And you start to go through it, you go, well, actually, this isn't particularly high quality. So although the vendor might now think that they're going to recoup their 150 or 200K renovation, we don't see it as being worth that. We see it being worth possibly nothing, because you might have to strip back some of that renovation and actually do a better job of it. So trying to understand the history of the property, but also ask the right questions in terms of what looks like success for the vendor as well. Some agents will agents ultimately have to do the right thing by their vendor, but the behaviors and the habits will tell you a lot about a property. If you go to an open home and there's 160 groups going through, and, the CV's 2.2 and they're quoting 2.2, the home's not going to sell for 2.2 million. It's going to sell well above that. So I think also Kiwis' reliance on CVs actually sets them back quite significantly.
Totally. I see this with the selling campaigns where I'm always diagnosing and chatting to the agents midway through this with the auction campaigns. Yeah. And occasionally you'll get a quieter campaign than you would expect for 2 reasons. Number one, maybe the CV or the elements that contribute to the CV are influencing the automated valuers. So your online estimates are sitting high, and the agent has somehow not kind of realize the impact of that. And so buyers are either not choosing to view it because they think it's not as, that in the absence of a price indication from the vendor, buyers I think are often hanging on to that perhaps foolishly. Because in the scenario where there's actually serious motivation on the seller side, the agent has been pragmatic in their appraisal and their guiding to the vendor. The vendor wants to meet the market, but maybe, and I sometimes have to explain it, maybe you actually need to signpost some of your need to sell quite authentically, and sometimes that's a bit of a chat about, hey, where's the line here of taste and confidentiality, but with permission of the seller to disclose that and to call it out and to say you need to ignore the online estimates because the seller has ... Exactly. And if they're not doing that, then people who are behaving as you're talking about, trying to get an idea, and they're thinking, I won't bother with this one because they probably want too much.
And this is the difficulty. Buyers don't know what to do, especially in this market, which is just saturated with property. And that is why we're seeing, we've talked about this. In fact, David was the auctioneer at an auction we were at recently, and I was helping a friend who was a buyer, and there were 5 groups bidding. Like, it was a phenomenal response. But it took minutes to even just extract an opening bid because buyers don't know where to pitch a price. They don't understand, what does the vendor want, and is the vendor realistic? Has the agent given me good guidance on the price? What does the CV mean? Who knows? And what do other buyers perceive the value as? So in a market like this, it's not what I think the property's worth, it's what you think the property's worth, and I can try and assess that value. And that's not the right way to deal with things. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of properties pass in, but people then going to a multi-offer quite quickly afterwards as they're going, now we've tested it, I know my bearings, now I'm going to put my offer forward. It's really hard for buyers at the moment to know, how do we choose a property? How do we pick a good one? Do all that due diligence we've talked about. But how do I know how to pay the best possible price? And that's what all buyers want. They ideally want to pay the
They don't want to overpay, for sure. Some buyers are okay to pay a market price, and some are fixated on trying to buy really well. I see the ones who have spent a bit of time
trying to buy really well and have got fatigued in the process. And funnily enough, in a negotiation, say at auction, sometimes they're the ones that are capitulating. I'm going back and I'm saying to the vendor, I'm saying, this buyer's got more to give and they will probably get it because you can tell they're just like, oh, we're done. We're going to buy this one now. But they were so hard for so long and now they're collapsing. It's almost like and I said this to one of my buddies and I'm interested to see what you think about it. But I said, mate, spend your time finding a property that really suits you well. And when you find one that really suits you well, like this is advice for someone who's planning to buy the house and live in it, right? They're not making a decision for 1 or 2 years. I mean, you're better off to move on it real quick when you find that and don't be too hard-nosed on price. Secure the right property. That's my 10 cents.
I think you're spot on. People do. They get caught up in the nicer things. You go, get on with it. If you want the home and you know you're paying a fair market price, you ask most people what they want. They say, I want a good quality home for a fair price. Because there's a lot of crap you can buy out there and you can get it for a bargain if that's something you want, but you have to deal with the risk and the repercussions with it afterwards. So, and that is why we've always said, let's go for quality homes. It's always try and buy a really good quality home because it's not going to cause you problems in the future. And yes, you may end up paying a fair price. And our job's to try and get it for the best possible price. But I don't get people call me up and say, can you please be our buyer's agent to get the steal of the century? Because a really good property will be desirable. If you think it's good, other buyers will think it's good as well. And it's exactly what you said. If you see something really good and it's popular, move on it fast. Get on with it. And you always look back. I look back at the deals I was doing in Sydney as a buyer's agent, 15 years ago. I think, oh God, we did well. We did so well. Those people are just laughing now, right?
10 years has gone by.
Yeah, exactly. Even a year later, you look back. I remember buying...
It depends on what the market does, though.
It depends on what the market does. And that's the other thing. It's really important. And that part of our job as a buyer's agent is to take the emotion out. We say, here's what the property is worth. Here's what we're going to try and secure it for. And this is how we're going to try and secure it. But I want you to tap out at this point. So we had a property recently we were bidding for, Kiwi guy living in Australia. We'd done really good due diligence on it, really tidy little, he's going to keep his investment and live in it in a few years. And we had the authority from him. We'd given him a value range and we had authority to bid up to that point. Property was about to be passed in, vendor's expectations. I could see the vendor getting very angry in the little glass cubicle at the back. He had his calculator out. He was calculating how much the renovation had cost him and everything.
It's hard because it's a sunk cost. It's very real, but it's irrelevant.
Exactly. And the agents come out to me, he goes, you know what, if we just do a deal at this level, we can just do the deal today. And I had the authority in the budget to spend that. I said, I'm not going to do that. We'll just walk away, leave it for a few days because the vendor will come down. They'll get a little more realistic about price. And then we will present an unconditional offer and we'll say, that's what it's worth. That's what I'm willing to pay for it.
And this is an interesting piece because I agree with the negotiating strategy with the following caveat, which is fine, I think, for you if you're really in touch with values. But the danger with that, because I've seen this happen as well, where from my perspective as the auctioneer, and I would say I treat the buyer fairly, but I do represent the seller. But I would say, I say with real heartfelt sincerity, if I think this is what's happening to the buyer, I say, just be cautious that you're not being too hard-nosed here, because based on what I'm understanding from the seller and from the agent, you probably are, and there's a very real chance that when this thing passes in and they start to engage with other interests, that you may end up kicking yourself. Are you sure? Because if there's a deal to be done today, but if you respect your decision either way, and that's where they've got to hit. Because if they understand the market, and it could be, because I don't know, like I say this quite sincerely to both sides of the transaction, I don't know values. I'm doing an auction here in South Auckland. I've done them in Taranaki. I don't know the market. I'm just working with what's in front of me. But if you've got the confidence, because you do know, and you think, no, I'm at the right level, and no one else is going to come in and beat me tomorrow. And if they do, they're paying too much. I'm happy to let it go. If that's the mentality, then there's a smart move.
100%.
But if you've been too hard nosed on that, and then disappears tomorrow and you go, that bloody agent.
I know. Well, and that's the thing, understanding who your competition is really important as well. And it's your competition of the other buyers, but also the other properties. And that's one of the benefits of us knowing the market. If we know there's a whole heap of properties coming up by next Wednesday, well, the vendor needs to be aware we're going to move on to another property. Also, we try to always be in a position where we have backup properties. So we say, you can take our offer here, and if you don't like it, it's totally fine because we've got other properties to move on to. So that you're holding a lot of power. But you're spot on that, and I touched on it before, that now a lot of properties are moving to a multi quite fast after that auction. Well, the worst thing is you're the strongest bidder in the room. You're up against 4 others like we had last week. That buyer had a real risk of losing that property over not very much because suddenly by Tuesday, 4 p.m., all the other multis conditional offers have come in, and then you're in a blind auction.
Exactly.
And the agent will give you this great advice: put your best foot forward.
Exactly.
And there's nothing more infuriating than hearing an agent say, put your best foot forward. So
what should they, because you know what, here we go. So here's things agents should say instead. Because, put your best foot forward, a very cliche way of saying that you may not get a chance to re-engage past this point, and sometimes there's no further engagement and it's sold. So it's what should they say?
Well,
do you think?
For the vendor's best interests, they are actually saying the right thing.
Is there a different way to say it then? Because surely it's almost like the media picks up a story and you see 4 different media outlets all saying sharp as attack, sharp as attack, sharp as attack, and you think, are they just coordinated or lazy? Are these agents coordinated or lazy? I remember my old sales manager used to say, and this was like coaching me in like multi-offers working with the buyer for the vendor, was, remember the words of Robert Muldoon, and he was before my time. Think big. So you can be clever, come up with something more.
Big. It was a brilliant concept. If I was a sales agent, which I'm not, I would call the buyers and I would say, I want you to put forward an offer that you're not going to regret, that you might miss it by $10 tomorrow. Think about what the home means to you and imagine that feeling of not securing that home. Because the problem with saying, put your best foot forward, well, I already know from our buyers, a lot of them we might be looking at a property at 1.5, but we've actually got 1.6, 1.7 to play with. That doesn't mean we're going to pay $1.7 million for that.
And this is a rookie mistake by some, I was going to say junior agents, but actually that lets a lot of people off the hook. This is just a mistake that some agents make, is they are finding out what the buyer's budget is, but they're not genuinely engaging with that buyer on this particular property. And they're feeding back to the vendor, we've got buyers with a budget of 1.7. And the seller's hearing buyers with a budget of 1.7 for my property. And when I'm querying the agent leading into it and they're telling me this, I say, okay, and what about for this property? I don't know. And they're not going to tell me the truth anyway. I say, well, yeah, I agree, but I hope that you've been making it very clear to the seller that this is not necessarily their budget for this property. That's just this buyer's budget.
You're spot on.
Man.
And the problem with this industry, there's low trust across all groups, right? No one trusts anyone. So when you're selling a property, the neighbor tells you it's worth 2 million. The genuine buyer tells you it's worth 1 million. It's probably worth about 1.3. But the agent, and again, I feel a bit sorry for agents because I say it's really important to give high quality feedback. And you're spot on.
We should adjust this as well. There's so much good stuff to talk about here. The things that I think are genuinely helpful for the sellers to know about working with an agent, and for agents who haven't figured this out. What you just said is so true. The neighbor comes through and says it's worth 2 million. That's not buyer feedback.
No.
That's the
gossipy neighbor feedback.
And the neighbor, exactly. The neighbor's thinking to themselves, well, if I tell the agent 2 million, one or two things, he'll talk it up to the buyers and make them pay that, or at least he'll prevent them selling it at that level where it probably should be sold, because it'll make my house look cheap.
Exactly. So that qualification of buyer feedback, and I credit to agents because I think a lot of them do try to get good feedback, and some don't. Some are, and I think they just go, what did you think of the property? Here's another odd question. It's the only time I've heard this is in New Zealand, is where they will say, agent will say to the buyer, what do you think it's worth? Poor buyers, so many of them, they don't work in real estate. And they go, I don't know.
And do you know what they're doing? This is what I think they're doing. So I sit with agents and coaching, and this agent who's, by the way, I take my hat off to this guy because he's really he's doing great work, and he's in a career progression in terms of his skill set. He's calling back after the open home. He's looking firstly to see if people are engaged in this property or if they're pursuing others. He's doing well with that. And there's this particular buyer. It's a large home with almost like a granny flat type configuration. So it's super large, suit a larger family or group together. Anyway, he's got kind of he goes, these people really liked it. perfect for their needs, on the phone to them, and they say, oh, actually, we're going to pursue this one in Manarewa. I could watch his face. He's crestfallen because he thought they were going to fire on this one. And then this is the words out of his mouth. And I thought, he's wanting to do the right thing, but not quite getting there, because he says, oh, okay, I understand. And he tried a little bit to see if it was definitely sticky on the other one, and they were. And he said, oh, okay, well, so I can get a bit of feedback for my vendor.
Yeah.
What do you think it's worth? And they said, almost without hesitation, probably about 1.75. Now, I'm watching his face as his mind explodes, because they'll take 1.75. You know, he's telling me it's like probably 1.5 to 1.6.
Yeah.
And he's now got 1.75. Now, two things here. Like, if he tells the vendor 1.75, he's going to make his job hard. And also, he's going to guide them incorrectly, because it's not worth that. The second part to this is that's what they've just told him. Yeah. So now is he going to mislead the vendor if he doesn't tell them? I'm quickly scribbling on the paper, say, ask what they would pay. And so he goes, out of interest, what would you pay for it? And they said, probably 1.45. I'm like, bring it now. See if you can get that. But this is what happened. As he's doing this, I'm bringing up the online advert, Trade Me, the homes estimate, 1.75.
Yeah.
They were bloody looking at it.
Yeah.
When the agent said, what do you think it's worth? They just went,
what was it?
1.75. And that's such poor guiding to the seller by asking what would you pay. At least they're now benchmarking with their wallet.
Because they're educating themselves on what's available.
They are.
Right? It's what they're looking at, the QEs and property values.
And this
that's what it is.
This is what buyers are struggling with, is that they go, well, let's look at all these algorithms and the CV, and the algorithms mean they really do. I've seen them all over the place. My buyers will send them to me. Oh, this is what I said. You're paying me quite a lot of money to take my advice on this. This is what the range is as of today's date.
Yeah.
And the sensitivities in the market. I met a few vendors, just, friends and family. And last year, they said, when should we sell? I said, August, September last year. There was not much stock. There wasn't a lot of competition, but there are plenty of buyers out there. But no, they all wait. They all wait till February, March. And that's fine. I understand people want to promote their homes at the peak of summer. Yeah. But the difficulty is you've now got a lot of stock. So those values can fluctuate month to month according to how much competition you have and what's happening in the economy.
It's all supply and demand.
Yeah.
It's the supply of properties that are fitting a certain need in the market and the need of the market. And it's how many buyers with capacity and motivation to purchase right now.
Exactly.
And those two little things are always fluctuating.
They are.
And I said this to a seller when they were referencing a property that sold a couple of months ago, and they were referencing this property, and I said, well, I appreciate that is true, but just recognize that property is not for sale anymore, and that buyer is not in the market anymore.
Yep.
It's a new thing, and we should talk about the appraisal piece, because this is quite important in the sense that, and I say this to agents when I'm coaching them, I say, you've got to understand, and maybe you should tell your owners that what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, what the market will be tomorrow based on what I know today by looking in the rear vision mirror. You're basically trying to drive this car looking in the rear vision mirror.
That's really, really well said. And it's very hard. I mean, one of the things I notice is that we have a huge number of agents in New Zealand, in Auckland, relative to the number of listings. And
I'm sure that's true everywhere.
It is, but it's got a particularly high proportion here in Auckland. If I compare it to, say, Sydney, if you look at the number of transactions that a Sydney agent does compared to Auckland, it's almost 2 to 1.
Wow.
So we have a lot of agents relative to the number of homes. And there's all different reasons for that. It's a relatively easy industry to get into. You can do it part-time. So there's a lot of agents who might do one transaction a year, and then there's agents who are doing 20 or 30 transactions in a year. So there's a huge discrepancy. But they are all having to compete for this little slice of the pie. And it's really hard for them to know, how do you compete against other agencies? How do you compete against other agents within your own agency? You've now got agencies who have got multiple agents who all are experts in that patch. Yeah. So how do you outdo those other agents?
This would make a bloody good TV show. Right? Wink. Nudge, nudge.
I think about it a lot, because I just go, because sometimes I'm asked, who should we use to sell our home? And we made a decision early in this business to not take referral fees. So if I recommend David is your sales agent, it's because I think he's really good. And I'll tend to give a couple of suggestions. I'll just say, look, I think this person's, they're really prominent there in their patch. They're very responsive. They work hard. That's the big secret to real estate. It's working really, really hard. And they've got good tech, good teams behind them, and they're committed to getting the deal done as well. So I do put a lot of thought into who I suggest. And
so suggesting this, I think this is interesting. I want to understand this a little bit more because it does two things. It kind of helps agents who would like to get more referral business. But also I think it's essentially giving some tips as to what a member of the public should consider when trying to select an agent. So is it just your friend that you know in the business?
No, I've referred agents I can't stand. But
really?
Yes.
Okay, so what would be the reasons?
Because they're very good at, I shouldn't say I can't stand, but I've referred over an agent before who I hate buying from, but he's a really good sales agent, gets really, really good prices. And
because he's by the vendor and you'll buy the buyer.
Precisely. So he will do, other buyers don't particularly like him in some ways, but he gets top prices. And that's because he's very, very good at what he does. He's very experienced. He's got a very good team around him. And to be fair, his team are really nice to deal with. And he's fine, but he's a vendor's agent. That's what he prides himself on, is getting those top prices. So I don't need to have a personal relationship with them. It's just you see people and you see by their effort and their hard work. And if you're talking to them a lot, if they're responsive, if they're active in the market, and if you deal with them and you think you're doing a really good job of giving good advice to the buyer, good advice to the vendor, and you're selling these properties, they're generally a really good sales agent. So I try to say to vendors, don't always pick the agent who's giving you the highest appraisal. What are they backing that up with? And how well do they really understand the properties that they're quoting to you? And it's your Rear Vision, example. But also, I think one thing that has made a lot of people lazy is computer-generated CMAs. I'm like, I look at some of these CMAs, I'm like, that's not comparable. That property faced south and had a damp garden.
It's a lesser version of AI. Like it's an algorithm rather than intelligence. It's parameters that are set that it's doing at a certain percentage of the land and the house size and the age of construction.
It's not factoring everything.
No. And the problem, again, agents are now having to produce so many CMAs, so many.
If you're going to use AI, you better proofread it. And if you're going to use one of those things, you better proofread it.
Precisely. So because we also do a sort of CMA for our buyers to say, here's how we've justified what we think is the right value. But we go through each property and we send a link over and go, this is why we think it's comparable. We went through the property and actually it had lovely natural light in the living dining and they presented it beautifully and it didn't have much competition at that time. That's why that sold for that amount. So going into that sort of detail and saying, these are why these are comparable and here's how it reflects the market now. And I do think agents should, if you give an appraisal in October last year, but the vendor wants to go to market in February, well, I'm sure a lot of agents are doing it. You do need to update that
I'm shocked
CMA.
how many aren't. And I'll often find out about this like a week or two out from auction. I generally sort of check in midway through a campaign and either talk with the agent and the vendor or just with the agent. But I'll often ask, what did you appraise it for? And then, okay, and would you appraise it at the same level today? And I know from having done that a lot that there are plenty of agents and I think we should talk about the dynamic. There are some agents out there who are deliberately overquoting because they think that if they say a high price, the seller will choose them. And the perhaps sad truth is that some owners are choosing based on that higher appraisal range because it's what they want to hear.
Greed and fear drive so many decisions, right? And of course you want to hear that.
There's also agents, though I would say this because I think I don't want to tar with the same brush. There's plenty of agents out there who I think probably get it right sometimes, get it a little bit bullish sometimes and a bit bearish sometimes. And they're doing their best to do that. But once again, they're doing the drive the car looking in the rear vision mirror thing. So if an agent's done that, I've often suggested in the REA guidances they should reappraise, but I see in so many cases that they're not really reappraising and they say to me, but I'm giving the seller the feedback and I've been updating them about those recent sales. I said this on the phone to an agent and the owner the other day. I said, have you done a new appraisal? Oh, no, I haven't. And the agent says to the seller, would you like me to? The seller said no. And I said, okay, well, that's all right. But I still think
it's probably best practice. If you appraised it last year and we're sitting in the market in March, you absolutely should be doing a new appraisal based on those new sales that have happened in the last quarter.
I guess it's hard for agents because what is the risk that you won't get? What's the risk that the listing will be taken off you if you have to come back and say, really sorry, vendor, but turns out your property's worth 200K less than I quoted.
You know what? It's a good thing to call out. So it's important to have that empathy to the agents. And maybe I'm just becoming a little cynical.
You're right, though, that the ethical, moral, right thing to do, and by not creating a rod for your own back, is to try and give the most realistic price as possible.
I think if an agent did this to me, I would probably take it with a pinch of salt. I'd say thank you, and I'd say, could you, out of interest, could you give me your honesty sheet?
Yeah.
Like, could you just give me the appraisals that you've done over the last year?
Yeah.
And then where they sold, so I could see, are you chronically over appraising or are you kind of, making an honest attempt here? And of course, you're just like everyone else. And by the way, subject to market trend, because if you're appraising and the market's going up, you're always going to look and feel amazing. And if the market's going down, some agents are beating themselves up. I mean, it shouldn't really be the thing that a seller's basing the choice of agent on. Yeah. But I like the knowledge piece in the market where you can tell I'm passionate about it. I kind of find it interesting.
It is interesting, isn't it? And I think one of the other things that would go a long way, because some things are out of your control, right? If you get slammed with a whole lot of property, if COVID came up again and suddenly the market, you couldn't do open homes, things can change. But one thing you can control is how you launch and present that property. And I think the agents do have a responsibility to go to a vendor and understand the property and say, here is how we're going to make the absolute most out of this property, to put forward the best that we can. That is having a realistic price expectation. That is how you get the best result.
I guess the biggest challenge on that is if I'm a vendor and I'm looking at all this data on available to me, and then an agent comes to me and goes, hey, by the way, it's worth 200K less, and then as a vendor, you think, first of all, you're not going to like that at all, right? Because you obviously want the price to be higher than that. So naturally what you just said is you're more likely to listen to another agent that's giving you the figure that you want to hear. But how do you manage those expectations? So it's a very challenging prospect for an agent to go, how do I give them the bad news, but also educate them around why? The whys are the important part. That tends to be like the miss in a way, is kind of going, how do you hook them so that you can educate them?
Mate, I'll tell you the coaching that I give to an agent. I'm really interested in both of your perspectives because it's quite interesting. Like I've got the kind of industry perspective. Yeah. You kind of know the industry, but you're sort of sitting on the seller side and you're working with the buyer. I mean, the coaching that I give to agents is I think you need to make a really good, honest attempt at the appraisal, but you should use it as a way to demonstrate that you know what's going on in the market. Exactly like you said. Hey, I know that property. It was filled with natural light and there was a particularly strong campaign. There were 3 buyers who actually probably took it above the standard market range. And so we have to be quite cautious about relying on that as a signpost to today's value. Like being able to talk confidently to that when another agent wouldn't do that. They just say, oh, your property's worth X because of this. I think that shows some, or the opposite way around, by the way, the sale that happened in the building, that was whatever the situation. So I coach salespeople to focus on what, demonstrating what they can control. Here's how we're going to approach our marketing strategy, and here's how I handle it by inquiry. Here's how I'm going to communicate with you. But what do you think?
Well, I mean, as a seller, I'd prefer to have that tough conversation and actually then climb the ladder rather than the other way down.
Interesting.
It's the worst thing, right? When you're going, you've overquoted it.
You seem to be controlled by logic and reason. This is the problem.
But it's how do you manage those the emotion? Well, you're emotionally attached to your property, right? If it's my property, you're emotionally attached to it. So obviously you want the best bucks for it. So there's that dilemma of going, how do we deal with this situation? Of course, we want the best for the vendor, but at the same time, we need to be realistic on what we're selling.
Precisely.
Right. And then that becomes a bit of a challenge. But my preference is that I have that difficult conversation at the start and then actually climb up rather than the other way down.
Yeah.
Because that's probably more difficult. to digest when you're midway through the campaign.
Yeah.
And they go, hey, by the way, the feedback is a lot lower than what we said.
Although I know
Very
right now, I can tell you right now, I bet there's someone who's going to jump in the comments. They're going to be the agent who's been honest, missed out on the business, and they'll be saying, I knew it was only worth that, but it was the other agent who sold it.
Yeah, you do get that right. And sometimes you end up looking at appraisals, and my friends will show me, and I think, oh, God, what a range. Maybe the advice to buyers is don't look at the quantity, i.e. the price that they're suggesting. Look at the quality of the advice they're giving you and the quality of their previous campaigns. It's your honest sheet piece, which is how successful have their previous campaigns been? And that's not just to say you should deal with someone experienced. There's some really hardworking, exceptional up-and-coming agents who are just working hard. And that is the other big secret, and I mentioned before, is really good agents, they just work really, really hard.
I can see that's a real core value for you. You know, and you, I would say, with what you're doing with the buyer's agency, that is very brave in the sense that you're doing something that, sure, there's a few around, but it's not the norm.
No.
And it's your own business. You're starting that from scratch. Tell us about that journey.
It's been incredibly rewarding because you prevail, you come out on top, and you think, yes, if I just keep pushing it, it's like we were saying about setting up the studio. You go, I know that there's a market for it, and I know if I deliver an exceptionally good offering, then I will get the response I need. But I have to be brave. I've got to take the risk and be out there and give it a go. I was lucky that I've been a buyer's agent in Sydney, and we acquired a big buyer's agency up in the UK when I worked for CBRE and out in Hong Kong. And then actually I spent some time living in France. We had buyer's agencies there as well. So I was able to sort of pluck out the best of each from that experience and turn it into what I wanted it to be. But there's a lot of people who tell you no. You get a lot of pushback. There's a huge amount of compliance you have to go through, the legalities, the insurance, everything. And because you're doing it sort of as the first person properly doing it in the industry, you want to get everything right. So I had heard about people previously who had tried to set up a buyer's agency. And that was one of the first positive things I heard is, oh, people have tried to do that and failed. You go, oh, well, brilliant. And you have visions of this like graveyard of buyer's agents who came before you. And the problem is a lot of people have thought they've seen Selling Sunset, and they think, and I know this because people call me and I say, why do you want to be a buyer's agent? They go, it would be a nice part-time job. You look at beautiful homes. I said, that's got nothing to do
I did not hear work my ass off. That's the prerequisite.
And the interesting thing is that, so when I started, so many people said no. And I pushed and pushed, and then you just work really hard. You make sure that you're always doing the right thing by your buyer, and that means being very ethical and having really strong morals. What are our principles as a buyer's agency? Because all agencies talk about integrity. It gets a word that gets thrown around. You go, well, what does that actually mean? So our business is purely based on reputation. We don't do any advertising. It's all word of mouth, and it's growing, which is fantastic. So the business speaks for itself. Our most powerful tool are our client testimonials. And I always say to current clients, if you'd like to speak to some of our previous clients, you're very welcome to. Then pick up a call and say, what was that journey like for you? So I have huge faith in the people that we have worked with, that they have also supported us. They are our marketing and advertising. So that's been really brilliant. The ironic part is you push and push and push, and you say, oh, and everyone goes, no, 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 no. Then you're 2 years down the track and people start trying to copy you. And you think, this is brilliant. So sometimes I get people trying to trick me and say, how are you doing such and such? And I feel like just saying, just come out and be like, we want to set up a buyer's agency. Yeah. How do we do it? It would just be a lot easier if you cut to the chase. And I think the industry will grow. I think people will, but it's going to be tricky because people are going to realize it's not Selling Sunset. It's a lot of due diligence. It's a lot of reading. It's a lot of analyzing. It's a huge amount of hard work, and it's not really selling. You are working with a buyer and understanding what their priorities are, finding the properties to match, but then understanding everything that's in behind that property as well. So it's fantastic because no 2 days are the same. It's always varied and interesting, and it is a new concept, and there is a business element to it that I love. It's really fun, but it's also a business that's based on reputation and relationship. So we can't afford to do something wrong. We have to do the right thing at all times, and hence why we keep a small number of clients. We focus on them. We work hard to make sure we're buying the right property.
Out of interest, why did you choose Auckland out of Sydney? After Sydney?
So I'd been in Sydney, went up to London, and I was based up there for 8 years between London and Hong Kong, and then between London and France. And I was loving my life over there. It was fantastic, but I wanted to come home, spend some time with my family, and the timing was right. In fact, the timing was terrible. It was COVID. And I sort of got stuck here. But I'd always thought there was a market for a buyer's agency in Auckland, despite all the people who told me it won't work. And we have this real thing about talking about the Kiwi culture. And I think that if we keep talking like that and that limiting voice, well, we'll never change. We'll never embrace anything new. And
culture's not static. It's
not. No, and we have to be embracing new ideas. And I'd seen it work in so many other markets. There were no factors in Auckland that would make it different. So I came back here, and also I think I'd done my time in Sydney. As fantastic as it is, I want to be back in Auckland. It's my home, and it's where I'm from. And I met my partner, and then I was really stuck. So, but no, I'd always want to set up a buyer's agency here. I thought it would work, and it is, but it's hard work.
There'll be some stalwart opposition from people that see, not necessarily correctly, that you're in somehow competition with them, and those roadblocks that you must be facing. So it's quite exciting.
We're getting there. We keep chipping, and it's lovely that at this point we now have agencies who actively say, "Come and speak to us." Come and tell us what you do. And it's been really flattering to get to that point where the big agencies are so supportive of us, and we can now pick up the phone and speak to most agents, say, I'm Alex Martelli Buyers. And they go, oh, hey, Alex, how are you going? And what do you think that property's worth? And agents now give us a call. What do you think? And I tend to be quite honest with them. I say, well, I think about that and that, and it's probably worth around there. So, and you can have a really lovely chat to them about what's happening in the industry and pick up a lot of intel from the agents themselves. So they're my new friends over the last couple of years.
So how do you work out? I think this is a question, for the public. How do you work out if your agent is really working for you?
Probably communication. I think if they're communicating regularly. So if I were to look at our own business, we set up we've got all these different channels where we're constantly communicating with our buyers as to what properties we're finding, what's buying and selling. We have a weekly call with our clients. We've got a little WhatsApp group we set up. So we're just constantly communicating with them and giving them feedback. And I would expect sales agents doing that as well. But probably communication, market knowledge, as you say, is very, very powerful. I'm being honest.
I'm going to give you some context. I meet these people, we're chatting, they are excited, they've just bought their first home. I asked about the experience. I love it when I meet people because of my industry involvement. Anytime I'm actually talking to someone who's right there at the pointy end of the transaction, I'm always interested to know about their experience, good, bad, because I'm learning from that because I'm trying to help agents do better work. Anyway, they said, we had a great experience. Oh, fantastic. Who'd you work with? Oh, okay, blah, blah. They said to me, we used a buyer's agent and we just don't know why more people wouldn't. And I thought to myself, I'm like, this is really interesting because I know a buyer's agent. Alex, right? And I said, who'd you use? And they showed me, and I looked them up, and they are working for a seller agency.
Yeah.
So I guess going back to my question, how do you know if the agent's actually working for you?
So how do you know if the sales or how the buyer's agent is working for you?
I'm a buyer.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with a real estate agent who says to me, I'll look after you, mate.
Yeah, that's very tricky. Because that's how do you know that they are? Are they bringing you forward 10 properties, 20 properties, 30 properties? Are they giving you advice as to what the property is actually worth? Are they doing the due diligence? And I bet you they won't, because they wouldn't want to put their name against it. It's too risky. In some ways, it would be easier to be a sales buyer's agent, because you could just say, hey, David, you should buy that house. I think it's worth about 1.4. When you pay 1.4, you go off and buy it. Very hard to come back on me when you discover there's a problem with the house, because that wasn't my responsibility to tell you or find out about the problem with
There's
the
a
house.
duty of care there.
There's a duty of care, but they're never going to investigate it. That's the difference, is they're not going to look into it. Absolutely. If you know something, you've got to disclose it. But if you never look into it too far, well, then there's nothing, you can't be held up for anything, and fair enough. So I think if you're working with a sales buyer's agent, which a lot of people do, that's fine. You can, but you need to try and gather as much of your own information and research as possible. And that's really, have you got the time and the capacity for it? Have you got the mental capacity to be doing that? And also, how do you decide what is the right price? That agent will want you to buy a property. That's pretty important, because they're not doing this for free. They're not a charity. And to be fair, you're not showing them any loyalty either. Chances are you're actually working with a few different agents. You see things pop up. That whole situation with conjunctionals is complicated. You know, if I'm a sales buyer's agent, I pretend
let's explain if you're watching this, what's a conjunctional. So a conjunctional sale is where you have a property that is listed. There's an agency agreement between the owners of that property and the agency they've engaged, which is representing the seller. And then the salesperson that you might be working with might approach that agency to say, hey, will you conjunct with me? Can we form a conjunctional arrangement? And by entering into a conjunctional arrangement, they are allowed to represent that property to you. But understand, they are representing the seller, or they should be. Occasionally I'm in the auction room and there's a conjunctional agent in there. And I'm like, I don't feel like this agent is helping to help me extract value. So I sort of take them aside and I just ask the question, can I just understand, are you being paid for this work? Yes. Well, you're actually contractually bound to help me and the sellers.
That's spot
and
on.
you should not be interfering with this. Step out of the room, please. You know, like that's the reality. If it's you there and you have said to me, yes, I am being paid by the buyer, I'll have a little chuckle and away we go. You know what I mean? Like, because that's just the reality.
You're spot on. And I think it's bizarre that New Zealand agents are allowed to call themselves a buyer's agent.
Well, they're not. Actually, to be fair, because now we're going to really go into it. For technical details here, there are salesperson licensees, branch manager licensees, and agent licensees. It's got to be an agent licensee to hold the license to operate as an agent, but you can have licensees that work alongside you.
You're spot on. And I think the problem is that a lot of people don't realize if you're a sales agent and someone comes along with their buyer and I now have to split away 30 or 40% of my fee to this person who just happened to have registered you at another open home, versus if I sell to you and I get to keep 100% of my fee, well, that is going to have some sway. That's going to have some impact for certain transactions, especially in such a competitive environment.
I think with some salespeople, you're right. I observe this. I think some salespeople are very, I guess, magnanimous if they're the listing agent. They just want to get a great result for their seller. But I think you're right. There are some there that go, gosh, I hope it's this buyer that gets it, not that one. I'm the auctioneer. I don't care. I just want to make sure we get the best out of the outcome that we can. But
I'm going to say something controversial.
Please.
I actually don't think there should be conjunctional arrangements because these days, what you're doing as an agent, the majority of your leads are going to come from either your own database, in which case they are your leads per se, or they're coming from the advertising, and anyone who's got internet in 2025 can access those listings online. So by claiming a buyer and then taking them to other properties, it's
well, in the absence of well-established buyer agencies, I notice where an agency or group of offices that do have a significant market share, there is, I think, both a good service being provided to buyers and a good service being provided to sellers where they are cross-pollinating and cross-selling. But if it's a smaller agency, it's very unlikely that they have the buyer pool at their fingertips across multiple different types of property. But I don't think that matters big time in terms of the result for the seller. Because actually, do you want to sell it to just the buyers the agency's in touch with, or do you actually want to make sure you market
as many
it to
buyers
all?
as possible, don't you? You want the widest possible audience. So that bit with the fees and the slicing and the pies and the bits, it's complicated. It adds another complication that I think a lot of vendors and buyers wouldn't realize is also happening. So, and that's why I say there's a lot of agents who don't even get involved in that. They just say, that's not my forte. I'm good at selling property and that's what I'm going to focus on.
It probably gets quite overwhelming for the sellers or the buyers. In general, just to kind of see how much of that.
Well, they don't really want to be involved in that, do they? They just want to know, are you getting me the best price or am I buying the best house for the lowest price?
So talk about that. You're looking at the property in the market. You mentioned before about working out, where the seller's head's at. What questions do you ask?
So it depends on, obviously, agents have responsibility to not disclose anything. And I'd never asked anything personally. Is the vendor getting divorced? That's not my business. That's not for me to know, nor should the agent share that. But understanding things like, has this property been on the market previously? What happened in that campaign? Usually you do a little bit of your own background information, and we're lucky we can access a lot of databases to give us that information. What does success look like for this vendor? What would they like? And often if you just stay very quiet, because the first thing that goes, price. But then they'll often talk to you a little bit more about what's really important to them. And it might be that they've actually found another home that they would really like to buy. And you go, okay, well, can we find a settlement that might work in for your vendors as well? Understanding the property going into it. And if the agent is going, well, the price guide's X, you're going, well, that's not correct because I know that the property is sitting here. And that's where an asking price tells you a lot. Even the search parameters of where the pricing has been set tells you a lot. Just look at the number of shoes outside the open home. That'll tell you what the house is going to sell for. And if it's being underquoted, because that's the other thing. We've talked a lot about agents overquoting in order to obtain a listing. You still get underquoting as well. And here in New Zealand, there's nothing wrong with underquoting. You're allowed to. In New South Wales, under fair trading, if you underquote a property, you get pinged on.
No, the code of conduct said you must not mislead as to the price expectations of a seller. So
You're
actually,
spot on.
So actually, it is unlawful.
But people can set it right at the base of a parameter and not shift that through the campaign, even though you know the price is going to go $500,000 above.
Something I picked up just talking to you though, and this is, I think, the advice, I might have even given this in a previous episode, which is like, just ignore what the agent's saying about price. You should know you should have your own opinion on price, because then that's actually the important thing is, and so you have that for your clients, the buyers, you sort of know where the price should be, that range that it should sit within, and then you can almost more or less just ignore the agents.
Yeah. And I think also that point about having the power. So, we talked how a vendor wants as many buyers as possible. So as a buyer, you want to have as many properties as possible. So if you've got other properties up your sleeve, whether you know they're coming to market next week, you might have a couple off market, something that failed to sell 2 weeks ago, you go, well, I've got a bit to play with here. I can dabble at this level, but actually if the vendor's unrealistic, then I can move on to something else. That's a nice position to be in.
How do you actually deal with that from a buyer's perspective who might be very emotional to a property? And then you're going, hey, like there are these other options and they're so pinged onto the one that you think might be overpriced for any reason, might not be suitable.
I've only had it once, and it was where my buyer burst into tears when they walked in the property. Oh no. So here we go. She just loved it so much. And we did end up buying that property. But the difficulty was the agent had seen her crying. And she said, my parents would have loved to have seen me in this home. Good. And that was fine. We got around that. But for most people, one thing we do with our buyers is we say, what are your priorities? And let's rank them. And then my role is to say, that's not going to happen. Don't worry about that. That's not a priority, but that is. So for most buyers, there will be, from my experience, there'll be at least 2 or 3 homes they go, yeah, I could live in that. I'd be very comfortable. I've never really had one buyer who's been totally wrapped up in one property, bursting into tears when she saw it. So generally you can be quite rational with people. And that's also our role as the voice of reason, is to say, we know you like this property, but here's what we're going to pay for it. Here's why we're going to buy it and how we're going to buy it. But you need to be able to walk away as well if someone sees the value significantly higher than you do, because there will be other options. As Karen, my colleague, says, if you miss one bus, another one comes along. There are always more homes, and you fall in love again. So just try and take some of that emotion out of it and be a little bit more logical and rational about it.
And so how does that factor into, like, obviously you mentioned about the different tiers of buyers that you have, especially like the first home buyers. Do you feel like you need to educate them a lot more in how the market landscape works versus, the people who are buying their second property or third property or what?
Probably. Yeah, you probably do have to educate them a little bit more. It was interesting. I sent a questionnaire out to, I think, 15 of our previous buyers and gave them a ranking as to what value they saw in a buyer's agent. And they could tick all the things, and most of them ticked everything. But the one that went much higher than I was expecting was understanding the paperwork. And we do this day in, day out. Of course, we understand the paperwork and the terminology. They didn't. This was a new language for a lot of first-time buyers. And they didn't want to be, because they're often competing for property quite fast, and especially for the good homes that say that it's called $800,000, which is a sort of entry level in Auckland, dare I say it, they might be going, I don't understand the terminology that's been used here, and the agent's pushing me to auction, but I'm not sure what else I need to do. I don't know what I need to look into. So yes, you actually do have to guide those buyers along more. They are some of the most rewarding searches you ever do, though.
You're spot on there, because like I was saying to you earlier, like we throw terminologies around like PBN and so on and so forth, but because you've been to thousands of auctions, but the buyer going in, this that first time, that auction environment, and 9 out of 10 times they wouldn't know how many buyers they're competing with until they're in the auction room. Yeah. And then all of a sudden they get very overwhelmed by the experience. And sometimes, especially when we go and shoot auctions for some of the agents, like we can actually see the fear in their face for how much they just
feel
freeze.
The tension.
They just freeze. Yeah. Right? I mean, how do you manage that, or do you prep them really well before going into an auction?
One thing, I mean, we don't buy too many properties under auction. Again, it comes down to each strategy for each property. Some you go, you know what, we are going to go to auction. One thing I often don't get the buyer to come with me. I always ask buyers to not bring children, because children can be very, very emotional. It's distracting, and kids get upset, you know, if they've fallen in love with a bedroom and you don't win it. They're upset, and it's really painful. So what I always say to my buyers is, we're going to go in with 3 figures. What would be your great price? What's the price that you know we really say is our maximum? And then if it sold for $1 more, you'd be comfortable with. And that's for me to guide them as well. Yeah. Because if someone wants to pay more than I'm advising them to, that's their call. That's their decision. They might have fallen in love with it. If you say, fall in love with a home, buy it. But we'll go in and say, that's going to be our strategy. I'll give you a good example of this. Some friends rang me up, because quite often I'm asked to just come in and bid, because people don't know how to bid. Mm-hmm. And this is a property over in Ponsonby, and they said, we've seen the property. It's okay. I mean, we're going to bid. We've had a builder through, but it's got a lot of problems. And if we miss it, it's not the end of the world. I said, okay. Anyway, they said, and we want to bid to 3.3 on it. So it's quite a big site. And I said, okay, yep, good. And I said, that's really maximum of what it's worth. Mm. And I spoke to the agent and got the feeling that the vendor's expectation's pretty punchy. Mm. Thought, interesting, this is probably going to pass in. So I speak to my friends and said, look, this is what it is. And another group come in, and they're on the phone, and they start bidding, and it's slowly getting there. And then eventually they go past our maximum. And my people in my ear, put another 20 in it. I said, don't do that. Put another 20 in it. That's what they want, I will. Mm. So I said, well, let's do 15. And then we varied it, and you know all about auction tactic and changing around your bids. And eventually this group, and they were really slowing down this other side. They were struggling. But finally they came above. And my friends, the look of despair. Anyway, this other group get taken into the little room, and they get brought back out into the auction room. They're there for a while. And the auctioneer goes, look, we're going to pass the property in at this level, which by this point is about $75,000 over what we've already delivered on. And my friend's very sad. I said, you said the house wasn't even right for you. You weren't that bothered about when you go, but you know, and the feeling. I said, we can still go in and buy it. It's still available to buy. Anyway, go away. Everyone feels all right. Bit of time sorts a lot of things out. 2 days later, my friends ring me up. Thank God we didn't buy that property. You know, we're so glad we didn't pay all that money. I'm like, yep, I know. That afternoon, the agent calls me, are your friends still interested in buying that property? I said, what happened to your other party? Oh, they've dropped out as well. So that hype,
this is
that
a
excitement.
masterclass. Like, I need to show this footage to some sellers that I've worked with of late. And also, by the way, it's so interesting because I say this about auction. You know, you don't really know how you value something until you've lost it.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's the powerful dynamic at auction, because you had it there at, 3.3. Yeah. That was the top. You lost it and you thought, actually, it is worth a little bit more to me. I'll do it. Yep. But also sometimes time helps, and sometimes, because it could have gone the other way. Yep. They could have slept on it a couple of days and go, gosh, let's go a little bit more. Yep. But man, is that a big gamble to play. And clearly in this scenario, they were glad they hadn't. But it doesn't always go that way. You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, but auctions, they bring out some interesting emotion.
Tell you what, here's a word to the wise, at least in what I'm seeing, and it's not going to be relevant to all price points in all areas, but right at the moment, where are we? March in 2025. Like there's campaigns now that are getting a reasonable number of inquiries and footfall, if you like, but the number of active participants is not really dramatically higher.
Yeah.
I think it's still kind of that phase where there's people out there gathering information. But, you know, like you were so true about the properties that are passing and then going to multi-offer. Man, if I was a buyer today, I would do the little bit of extra legwork to be in an unconditional position, because there's a very real possibility you might just be uncontested with a direct line to the vendor, and quite often a bona fide wants to meet the market seller versus being in a blind situation
100%.
where you're playing a big guessing game and you might be competing against another handful of people because they're there through the campaign now, but they still need their finance approved. They still need to get a builder through. They still, you know.
Yep.
So anyway, my 10
Spot on.
cents.
Yeah, I think you're completely right on that.
Good times, guys.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Have you got a question, Harps? A bit of a thought provoker from our last
no.
guest.
Yeah,
From our last guest, do we tell who it was? Who the guest was? It's left the question.
So we had Jen Beard, last one from the
Good lady.
year of REA in bed. And
Shout out to Jim.
the question,
Yeah, go
the
Jen.
question we had asked her was from a previous one was what was her favorite car?
Yeah,
she was not very impressed by that.
No. Don't worry. She's left. She's really a stonking great question for you here, Alex.
Oh, no.
But she left a question that had a bit of it felt a bit more deeper for us. We were like, oh, that's pretty good. So her question was, what has been your motivation in the last 12 months?
No, the most meaningful lesson you've learned in the last 12 months.
What's the most meaningful lesson I have learned in the last 12 months? That's a great question. Well done, Jen. Tricky one too. I like the car question.
We're not going to let you off the hook that easy. It's good.
No.
Take a moment.
Memorable lesson, I think, is that tenacity is a very important skill to have. You have to keep pushing and really believing in what you do. And I think communication is absolutely essential. And that includes sometimes giving hard and harsh feedback. But you have to be, sounds a bit waffly, you got to be true to yourself and the advice that you're giving, and good to the people around you. Make sure that you're giving them good quality advice as well. And that's something I've had to do. I've had to learn a bunch of lessons along the way as well, and saying, how do we give advice that is, you know, especially if it's very easy that people come to you and you go, oh, we want this, this, and this. You go, oh, yeah, I'm going to go out and find that. But you have to go, actually, that's not realistic. And I need to tell people that's what we're going to achieve and that's not what we're going to achieve. So giving really honest feedback is very, very important, even if sometimes people don't like it.
What have you learned about how to deliver that?
Just explain why that is. Give, you know, a good explanation, and people will understand. People appreciate you explaining to them why something's difficult or challenging. It's that term, integrity. But I think that's been a real lesson. And another interesting one is that if you don't embrace technology, you will fall behind. There are processes and systems you need to be keeping up to date with, because otherwise they'll overtake you. So really focusing on what our processes are, what technology we're incorporating, what systems we're putting in, that is a very integral part of our very human business.
Tenacity. What is tenacity to Alex Martelli?
Grit and perseverance. Keep pushing through. Every bastard tells you no. It is. It's especially if you know that it's a good thing. If you know what you're doing serves a good community, you have faith in what you're doing. Like, I think buyer's agency is a game changer for the industry, and I really support it. I believe in it. I'm not threatened by competition. If other people want to set up a buyer's agency, go for it.
Yeah.
What that means is that it's a system and it's a way of doing business that is going to help people and you know, really help to balance the game as well. So,
and it's such a business that it's what value you add to your buyers, to your clients.
Absolutely.
Where do you see that going in the future? Do you feel it's going to develop to become a norm?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because what I saw in Sydney when I joined the buyer's agency I was with, we were 4, tiny, and by the time I left, it was about 30. That was only 3 years later. Grew. the problem now in Sydney, and I often go back and chat to Simon Cohen, who I worked with. I said, what do you see? And he goes, just every man and his dog's now a buyer's agent. And the standards become low and poor. And the reason he's continued to do so well is he's kept his standards high.
Yeah.
At first he was one of the first into the market. It's very, very important. But also his team really know their market. When I worked for him, I knew my patch and we were really passionate about what we go in. There's really good values. So people go in and talk about what are our values. Because that has to guide you, because it's very easy to damage your reputation pretty quickly. And now Sydney's just saturated with buyer's agents. There's so many one-man bands. Admittedly easier over there to set up a buyer's agency because you didn't have to worry about all the insurance and the compliance, and they don't have like an equivalent of a real estate authority. It's just different over there. Whereas here in New Zealand, it's much harder. So the challenge people will have is, how do you build up a reputation? How do you keep that reputation? How do you get through all the compliance, legalities and everything else? And that's been, it's taken me, it took more than 6 months just to get to the point of starting a buyer's agency. It was a huge amount of work. And that's why as I grow the business, I'm starting to bring more people in. I'm really picky, because I've worked so damn hard to get to this point.
Yeah. What would be your sort of top 3 tips for buyers out there who obviously are going and doing it by themselves and don't know yet that they actually need a service like this is on offer for them?
I think if you were out buying on your own, and people aren't going to like this, but it's a full-time job. Like, you have to put a huge amount of time and effort into it. And it's almost worth planning out your own work time to say, I'm in a property search. I might actually have to cut back some of my work hours because it is going to take a lot of my time. Probably be tip number 1. Tip number 2, use some of the available portals and resources. Look at the Auckland flood map viewer. Look at things. There's a natural hazards register. A lot of people don't even think to look at that. Pop into the natural hazards register, see if there's any history on the property. In line with that, get yourself a really good property conveyancer. Don't use your friend's mum's cousin who's a wills and trust specialist. Use a property conveyancer because they really understand property. You might pay a bit for it. And third thing, pay the money for good consultants. Don't go cheap on your consultants. Get a building inspector with a really good reputation. Get a conveyancer with a really good reputation. If you're getting a buyer's agent, find a buyer's agent with a good reputation. Bring good people in to help you because they're worth their weight in gold when you go to buy. Don't get cheap on that stuff.
Fantastic. Yeah. Would you like to leave a question for our next guest?
Yes, it's got to be a weighty one like Jen's. I was thinking about this. I think my question would be, if you look through history, so it could be someone alive, could be someone who's passed away, who's someone who you would love some advice from, and would you have a question that you would like to ask them? But it could be anyone. It could be from asking Shakespeare how he wrote a great poem to I don't know, Elon Musk, how do you build a multi-billion-dollar business? So, someone in your life or history.
Would be yours?
That's a really good question.
See, I couldn't help myself. I was going to ask the question too, mate. It's fantastic.
There's a few people. I think there's some really phenomenal people I'd love to speak to about leadership and breaking through barriers. Actually, dare I say it, in the political field, I look at whether you love or hate Maggie Thatcher. I think what she did was really incredible. I was lucky enough to meet Helen Clark recently, and she's brilliant. Like what she achieved in her time. And it's funny when you look at how political parties change over the years and what she led in terms of New Zealand in the early 2000s and what was happening in the country in terms of a cultural scene and arts and film industry. Like, she was fascinating. And she had some really good advice for me as a leader. It's not about being a woman, dare I say. It was just about being a really strong leader.
A visionary leader that was going to do it.
What was her advice?
Keep pushing. No, she's got real grit and tenacity, and she's a very bright woman, and her career has continued to go far beyond New Zealand politics. She's a real go-getter.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Alex Martelli, tenacity, grit, keep pushing, and yet in such a well-spoken, educated, intelligent way. What a privilege to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's much
Thank
appreciated.
you. It's been a pleasure having you here, and so much insightful information that people out there listening, there's a nuggets of information that they can take away. And of course, like the importance of having that knowledge and that sort of service available probably a lot of people out there probably don't even know that exists. And yes, there's almost been like a side-on service available from sales agent side, but that the fact that this exists and the buyers out there could be looking and going, right, we can actually tap into this and actually save ourselves a lot of time, but a lot of value.
Yeah. Thank you.
Actually, a little recap that's just appearing in my mind is that, if you want to hit a home run in property, you've got to know enough to know that your consultants and advisors and representatives are the best in class, but don't just DIY it.
Yes.
Get great representation.
Yeah. Why wouldn't you? This is possibly the biggest asset you're ever going to put all your pennies into. Get the best people on your side.
And the landscape of the whole thing has changed so much now that you probably do need to surround yourself by the right experts.
Definitely.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.